Bonsoir. Good evening. Madame
Bonsoir.
Bonsoir, Saskia. Hello, dear Saskia. How are you?
There we are.
Can you see me? Yeah? Can you see me? I don't know if you see me. Madame la vice-présidente du conseil de fondation, chère Beth, cher Jacques, membre du conseil de fondation, cher Andrea, dear colleagues, chers collègues, dear students, and last but not least, dear Saskia, dear Professor Sassen, welcome. Welcome to this opening lecture of the academic year 2021. La professeure Sassen nous fait un très grand honneur cette année de délivrer cette conférence d'ouverture et nous lui en sommes vraiment très reconnaissants. The title already is whetting our appetite. Can complexity camouflage violence? But before we get to listen to this opening lecture, Madame la vice-présidente du conseil de fondation, Beth Krasna, will award Professor Sassen with the 2020 Edgar de Piccioto and International Prize. In her laudatio, Ms. Krasna will present Professor Sassen, even though I don't think she needs an introduction in this room. But before I leave the floor to you, dear Beth, let me just say how delighted I am that Professor Sassen is giving the opening lecture this year, as I just joined the Institute. I've known Saskia for a number of years now, since 2013 exactly, when I invited her to be a keynote speaker at a conference I organized on the Singapore campus of ESSEC Business School, where I was then professor. You remember Saskia, I'm sure.
Yes, yes.
Even though we didn't know each other then, Saskia answered immediately and very positively. The title of that conference at the time was Globalization and the Return of Geography. Already, the idea was that space and all that goes with it, culture, history, embeddedness, still mattered in spite of and maybe because of the progress of globalization. The presentation Saskia made of her then forthcoming book, Expulsions, that came out at Harvard University Press the following year, was striking, enlightening, as all her work has always been to me, by the way. A few years later, I was very lucky to collaborate again with Saskia in a large project that Marc Fleurbet, myself, and a small number of colleagues coordinated. The panel, the International Panel for Social Progress, was an ambitious endeavor. We coordinated 22 teams of more than 10 scholars each from around the world, a total of 300 scholars. Difficult to imagine that you can coordinate such a group of scholars to assess the state of things on almost all dimensions of social progress. By the way, quite a number of faculty members from the Institute were involved in the IPSP from the start. Saskia had accepted to be the coordinating lead author of Chapter 5 on cities and social progress. Here again, her intellectual leadership proved key, and I really strongly recommend that you look on the IPAP's website at this chapter. Don't recommend that you buy the book. It's very expensive, but I'm sure the library has a copy. But you can also look on the website at other chapters. There are 22 altogether, and at a number of videos and shorter materials that Saskia was willing to put together to facilitate access to the knowledge embedded in that dense chapter. So life does things in the right way sometimes. It is by chance that I'm standing here as the new director of the Institute precisely the year when you are receiving that prestigious award and delivering our opening lecture, dear Saskia. But it is, I must say, an immense pleasure to welcome you today, although naturally I only wished you could have been physically with us today. Thank you, dear Saskia, for all your scholarship, for what you represent. We are very honored to have you with us today. Thank you.
Well,
and now Beth will come on stage.
Dear Professor Sassen, it is a great pleasure to welcome you to the awards ceremony of the 2020 Edgar de Piccioto International Prize. This prize was created as a tribute and token of thanks to Mr. Edgar de Piccioto, who, with his family, has made an extremely generous contribution for the realization of the Edgar and Danielle de Piccioto Student House that hosts students coming from around the world. The Edgar de Piccioto International Prize, awarded every 2 years, is intended to reward an internationally renowned academic whose research has contributed to the understanding of global challenges and whose work has influenced policymakers. The prize was awarded the first time in 2012 to Amartya Sen, the 1998 winner of the Nobel Prize for Economics, in 2014 to Saul Friedlander, Emeritus Professor at the University of California, Los Angeles, and recipient of the 2008 Pulitzer Prize, in 2016 to Paul Krugman, winner of the 2008 Nobel Prize in Economics, and in 2018 to Joan Wallet Scott, Emerita Professor at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University. Dear Professor Sassen, you are a student of cities, immigration, and states in the world economy, with inequality, gender issues, and digitalization, 3 key variables running through your work. You are the leading theorist of cities in the global world, having shaped the concept and methods that other theorists have used to analyze the role and place of cities and their networks in our contemporary world, marked at least until recently by deep globalization trends. You came up with the concept of global cities, emphasizing the flows of information and capital that shape and frame major cities across the world. Over your 20 years of research, you have published 8 books and are the editor or co-editor of 4 books translated into over 20 languages. You have directed and been a member of several research projects and have received multiple research grants. You have also received many awards and honors, among them 13 doctorates honoris causa and over 25 named lectures. You have been named one of the 100 Women in Science, won the 2013 Príncipe de Asturias Prize in the Social Sciences, were elected a foreign member of the Royal Academy of the Sciences of the Netherlands, and made a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et Lettres by the French government. These distinctions recognize the importance and breadth of your work. Last but not least, as regards the De Piccioto Prize, you have been a committed and influential participant in the public debate. Your comments appear in many journals, like The Guardian, The New York Times, Le Monde Diplomatique, Le Monde, International Herald Tribune, Vanguardia, Clarin, Die Zeit, Newsweek International, The Financial Times, among others. You have strongly contributed to framing and influencing the discussion on issues that we care very much about at the Graduate Institute, because they are of crucial importance to the future of the world. For all these reasons, we are extremely pleased to award you the 2020 Edgar de Piccioto International Prize. And since I believe we sent you the award, but you're not in presence here, so I can't hand it over. So for the people present and on the web.
Yes.
Here it is, and I believe it is being framed by your husband.
Exactly, yes.
Thank you very much, and congratulations.
Well, thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. I really am very, very grateful, and it is an enormous honor for me to be here. And I wish I was going to talk about beautiful things, but regrettably, our world has so many problematic conditions that is going to be a bit my focus. And the notion is, of course, going in a positive direction in the sense that we must change some of the foundational elements that are in play today. in order to have a better world for many more people than now can actually benefit from the good things we're capable of. And so the title, Can Complexity Camouflage Violence, is clearly an indication that I think, yes, we admire complexity, and yes, it can camouflage violence, precisely in part because we admire complexity, and so brutality can innate a presence in many, many of our situations. Now, again, I just cannot thank the organizers of the event, the prize. I am just really deeply honored by this. And I wish I were there, but my school, my university said no, partly because of my age. They said that very politely, but they said if I were 25 or even 45, I could have been allowed. But at my age, they prefer not. So here we are. Now, what I want to talk about is something that I'm working on now. And one way of giving it a title is the title you see there. Can complexity camouflage violence? We know that complexity can camouflage violence. It has always existed. What marks the difference today in my reading is the extent to which complexities that time one we admire, by time 2 or 3, they can become truly negatives. I see a kind of, I don't want to be too negative on the matter, but I see a kind of facility, ease with which a complex condition can lend itself to brutalities that are camouflaged precisely because we're dealing with an admirable complexity. I think that much that starts as complex in a positive sense can with greater ease today than in past epochs actually become a negative. And I find that particularly alarming because it leaves us with this notion, and this is, for instance, a very strong condition in a country like the United States. It leaves us with a notion that if it is complex, it must be good. And to some extent, I mean, there can be a truth to that, but increasingly, we have got to be on guard. Now, I can address only a few aspects of this complex subject here. So I clearly am not going to cover the full spectrum of these sort of emergent conditions, which start out as admirable instruments and too easily wind up becoming a negative, something destructive, something that can capture element. Now, I think our current period is one that increasingly is drawn to complexity. I would really love to hear what the audience thinks of that, comment of mine. It's very difficult to establish this, and different cultures certainly have different modes of handling this. But I would really like to hear in the discussion session how this question of complexity and brutality works out, in some of the situations that you are familiar with. Now, complexity in itself is a capability that our current period, as I said, is really drawn to. And you see it even with children. Children are actually, you have a whole kind of new child. Not my child wasn't necessarily that way, that goes back quite a bit, but who are absolutely interested in having to deal with the elements of a toy, let's say, where they have to enter, they have to break something, they have to discover something, they have to understand something. A question that I would have to the audience, you don't have to answer immediately, clearly, is to what extent they also have seen that experience. I mean, I think that when I was a child, I didn't have that kind of already embedded intelligence about complexities. And you see that more and more, I would say, I see that with my young students. That has become part of our knowledge zone, you know, and these complexities are marked by something that is not completely visible. So it brings in another dimension into the picture that is also something that we have not necessarily, I think we social scientists, worked enough on. So for me, this is also a bit of an experimental move to see what it is that we should pursue in greater depth. And I want to repeat again this notion that increasingly complexity is a type of capability that our current period is drawn to. And we see that with children, as I said already, right? But I want to emphasize that the fact that children are drawn to these complexities, partly, I think, for adults and for children, complexity functions as a secret that we need to disrupt, a secret that we need to take over. And in that sense, of course, you can understand, especially for younger people who are experimenting, because that's what growing up means, that you are experimenting on a whole lot of fronts. And I think that that is, to me, actually quite an important little point. Second critical element of this current period is this notion of what I call embedded borderings. These are borderings that we do not necessarily see with our eyes. We might experience them when we cross into one of those setups where we are not meant to be. The not meant to be is not necessarily a function of a policeman or a guard, but it is a complexity that we cannot handle or a situation that becomes dangerous to us if we take the next step. You know, in other words, complexities in play that contain within them capabilities we may not be able to manage, we may not be able to truly engage. That is sort of a bit the notion. Now, so one way also of thinking about it is that complexity can hide its own negatives, its own destructive capabilities. And to me, there is something both attractive, interesting, admirable, but also something that invites me to think, to be on alert, in a way, in situations where in the past I would not have felt need. And I would really love to hear from the audience if any of you is also dealing with these kinds of issues, you know, where the complexity is not just an admirable condition, that it also becomes a condition that you want to understand better, because you know that there is something happening there that is not quite, as we would say in New York, kosher. I don't know if that means something, that word, but anyhow, it somehow does not quite fit. The second element that is also in play, not as it is in my analysis, not as it is usually put in play, but in another way. So I'm talking about value chains. And as you know, these are in play, we're all familiar with it. They facilitate, they streamline. These value chains have become critical, constitutive elements in our economies. But and they are really an important invention of our current period. But the problem with the value chain is that we, the average citizen, let's say, the average person who who lives in a city, etc., is that we cannot track them. At some point, we lose capacity to actually track, to know what is going on. And these chains are so long that, you know what I'm talking about, right? A multiplicity of actors that keep intervening, so that even now we have that, say, for potatoes, which should just go straight from potato to kitchen. They are embedded in systems of delivery that contain within them often these multiple chains. Now, potatoes is a very simple example. Mostly I am thinking, of course, of more complex examples. But this notion that even the simplest element today does not simply go, from A to B. It has to go from A to B to C to D to E. And that I'm just invoking foods here, what we eat, etc., because it's a simple example. But clearly, it takes on very different forms. If you say, for instance, a university. In our universities today, we often have to go through rather elaborate chains in order to get at what we want access to in our universities, access that we're entitled to. This is not access that we are, violating something, not at all. So why that? Why do we have, in a whole multiplicity of ways, a long series of chains that move on and on? Now, I have looked particularly at financial systems and such. When you look at those systems, you find an answer without too much difficulty, it seems to me. I mean, the system in itself, the algorithmic math and all of that can be very complex. But this notion of these chains, which are also in play in the financial system, something I have worked on quite a bit, there you just have to stand back and ask yourself, why? Why these long chains? Now, we have very simple examples from the past, from economies that are sort of older economies, where you can see that, and that is that in order to bring the food out of country A and bring it, say, to the United States or to London or to Germany or to Switzerland, you have to just go through a whole set of steps. It's not right there. I think we should begin to interrogate this. Now, Europe is particularly good about avoiding this in a way that many countries, say in East Asia or the United States or Brazil or, where in these second type of countries that I'm talking about, there is a real strong presence of these intermediaries, and the intermediary, of course, is an actor that never loses, no risks. The risks are with the originating and with the final buyer. The intermediary, no matter what happens, always gets what was arranged, if the system is more or less clean. And one of the elements that I have noticed in my own research, especially on high finance, is the rise of intermediaries. And these intermediaries, I repeat, do not lose. And that, I think, is something that we should be on alert, because that seems to me is not correct. There is something dodgy there, as the Brits like to put it. There's something that shouldn't be that. It also means that, and I think in Europe, the simplest examples, the familiar examples of this are the farmers who produce the good food, who produce the good milk, who produce, all the good stuff. And then for them to take it to market or to take it to whatever the apparatus that then sells it to the larger public, they are going to lose something. They have to lose something. They have to pay. They have to take an insurance. They have to, etc., etc. And I see so much of this that I'm beginning to ask myself, is this a subject that we should actually explore? Because again, I repeat, the intermediary, he's in a very particular position in our economies. And that is that the intermediary rarely loses. And the ones that are at risk are the final buyers and the originators. The originators because of all the risks of making, of producing, of raising cattle, of whatever the different economic instances. And I think there is stuff here happening. There is something that is moving, ça bouge, as the French say, that we need to get into because it is really a feature of major powerful actors, whether that is high finance or the big firms that really control a lot of the food production. Now, just a little footnote. I know that Europe, and certainly your country, they are quite more protected from these trends that I'm describing than is the case in much of Asia, than is the case of all the Americas, that is in the case also of some countries in Europe. I know that Switzerland or even the Netherlands, etc., they just have their own systematicities, their own modes, and they are far less affected. But in many other countries, in most other countries, the farmers who used to take the milk straight to market and then got their income have to go through an intermediary. It also is a question that has to do with the expansion of of our need for shops because we don't grow our own food, etc. But I do think that there is something happening that uses, as I like to put it, and not everybody necessarily agrees with that has to do with intermediation. And the intermediary, I repeat, is the actor in our economies that rarely and really almost never loses. The two other ends, the one who invents the product or brings the product or whatever it might be, and the final, what I'm thinking about now is high finance, which is the mode of capturing plusvalia. In Spanish, we say plusvalia, the rent, if you want. So these are sort of issues that I am very interested in. And coming back to the value chains, the value chains are an important invention, for our current period. And they are serving us very well. But there is also this entering of extractive actors that just take a little. And the ones who wind up losing are both ends, the originators and the final buy. Now, we see this also, just to give you an example that some of you might be familiar with, some Dutch experts on certain sort of financial aspects established, this is a story that involved the Netherlands, established, and they were critics of this, and they brought it to light, if you want. They saw that the big financial firms that were involved also in retirement funds. This is a case that some of you may have heard of. It became a very famous case. And then I repeat, so that financial firms, are involved in, etc. It turns out that there was an intermediary step that allowed financial firms to take out a bit of money. Now, and that has now, in the United States, many of the major funds that support workers after retirement have been used in this way. The taking out is just a little bit, just small amounts, but millions of small amounts. The result, however, is that the people who lose, they can't do anything about it. You see, it might be very little, but the financial firms that are doing this gain a lot, whereas the people who are doing the work, etc., and who are losing that, they lose a little. So they don't notice it because we're dealing with millions of retired workers. However, this is absolutely unacceptable. But it is one of these cases, again, where what is unacceptable is rendered invisible. it's very difficult for the average worker, the average person, the average professor to be on top of this, to see what is happening. They notice, oh, look at that, just a little less in my monthly whatever, or but you're not going to take action on that. You don't even know where to start. So this not knowing where to start to contest these modes is part of the story. It's why it works. It works for those firms precisely because we don't even try to sort of engage and go there. It's just a little. I repeat, at the other end, it's millions and billions, because we're talking about millions and millions of workers, certainly in a big country like the United States. The figures clearly change, the numbers are smaller in a country like the Netherlands or Switzerland. But this is something that now a set of economists in the Netherlands have decided to fight and to engage. Now, just one more comment on the value chains is that the value chains have a very pretty name, value chains. They really are not a pretty element. They can, in many situations, be very useful and helpful. But the point here is that they are an extractive sector that dresses itself in the language of value chains. Value chains sounds so good. Chains of value. I mean, who can object to that? So this is another element that is proliferating and that I'm very interested in, which is to see the kind of language that we're using in order to camouflage a violence. That's also the title of my talk here. And I make it into a question. Can complexity camouflage violence? Yes, it can. And we have become admirers, I am one too, of complexity. The levels of complexity we have reached in our current societies are really extraordinary. I mean, there is extraordinary stuff happening. Young people are capable of developing things, with all kinds of instruments. That's extremely, extremely valuable. But point you realize that we have a problem, and that is that complexity, which looks beautiful, which really does involve great minds, but that might just be one step in a chain that then leads to the camouflaging of the violence that is also part of that chain. In my reading, the present moment, this epoch that we're living, is marked by an extraordinarily brilliant use of brilliant instruments to camouflage a lot of negatives, a lot of violence, a lot of losses of something that we used to have and now we lose. And of course, the issue is also that we lose it in these tiny, tiny, tiny versions of itself. And hence we barely notice. Again, I want to say that one of the first ways in which we understood that this was happening was with one of the major retirement funds in California, which is a famous fund, it's much admired, and it had simply been invaded. And we're talking here, I repeat, millions of workers affected, millions. And it had simply been grabbed, so to say, by a very, very distinguished financial firm. But we then saw records that showed conversations where they were saying, okay, we just take a bit of here and a bit of that. They said it in more complex languages, but that's what they were doing. This is extraordinarily alarming. Now, I'm going to begin to wrap up. The United States is a place that never completely left, the wild zones that it entered, that it created, etc. It is not Europe. It's not a a place that has the long histories, etc., that your country has and that other European countries have. So that has meant that, on the one hand, the United States has been, for a long time, it is losing that now. I would say in the last 20 years, it really has lost. There's been a place of many innovations, of many inventions, of many good things, really good things. Today, it is far more problematic. And it seems to me that we are seeing the decay of that model. You know, the United States, the Wild West, people willing to work extremely hard and raise hundreds and hundreds of cows and milk for, you know, their full life, all every day, getting up at 3 a.m. and all of that. It's different today. And I think that what is a bit different also is that a certain kind of fatigue has set in. Too many Americans is a very general term here, but too many have actually suffered losses and understood that life is really not giving them what they thought they would have. Europe, in that sense, and I would argue also a country like China, Europe, an old country, I mean that in a positive, has of course had extraordinary histories and keeps being, these kinds of issues that I'm talking about, keeps being one of the good members of society, you know, in the sense that, of course, you have extractive sectors that just want to get, you know, but it's nothing compared with so many other countries in the whole Americas sector, for instance. So Europe has been a very special place. And so if there's one question that I would have for you, the audience, that we may want to discuss, it is also if you detect sort of a change in certain foundational aspects of how life and business are constituted today in a thriving country like yours, or in thriving countries that you know of or you belong to, Germany, the Netherlands. You know, do you detect these emergent modes that we can really safely describe or properly describe as extractive, as extracting something in a way that you find alarming? So, just to conclude, in the United States, some of the most brilliant minds, and I'm thinking, for instance, of a big financial firm that shall remain unnamed, which has 1,000 brilliant minds, physicists mostly, working to maximize how the firm can extract gains from just anything. Now, as you know, there are certain forms of knowledge, etc., where you can really do that. I mean, those are capabilities that are in play, and so I would be very interested in hearing if any of this stuff that I've been talking about, you know, which is sort of emergent condition, some of it has been around for a bit, but still, mostly its expansion is what is in play here. And the expansion is sort of new, in the sense that a new form of aggressive extraction is emergent, even in sites, in places, and vis-a-vis conditions where we did not used to see that. Extractive modes have always existed. What we have today is a proliferation of such extractive modes. So in that sense, and turning to ending, if you want, with the title of the talk, my question is really about how much of the existing violence that includes a lot of new forms of violence that really dress themselves in extraordinarily interesting and brilliant intelligences, but how much of it is actually camouflaging forms of violence that are not the typical one. You know, they shot somebody dead, they stole a cow, whatever. No, it's another kind of violence. It's a violence that is marked by intermediation. It's like an intermediate space where this violence can thrive. And it rarely is found guilty because it is an intermediate. It's neither at the start nor at the end. It's the intermediary. And the simplest example, of course, is that we are all familiar with is food that used to be brought by farmers to the city or whatever, now has an intermediate stop very often. Maybe in your country you still do it the good way. And the intermediate is a business that doesn't care about food at all, but it will raise the price at the other end. And it forces a lower price for the farmer who has produced the good. That intermediary doesn't lose. The farmer loses and the buyers lose, but not that intermediate. So I leave you with this not so very happy final comment, but there it is. And I really hope that you could hear me well, because I cannot tell whether I spoke loud enough for everybody to hear me, but since I didn't hear anybody raising the hand saying, no, 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 we cannot hear you, I assume that you heard me. I thank you very, very much for your attention.
Thank you, dear Saskia, and I can confirm that we heard you really well. That was really
good.
Perfect. The technology was, the gods of technology were with us today, so that's great. So we have a bit of time for questions, and just to give everybody a bit of chance to think about their questions, I guess I'm going to take the, use my position to send you the first question. So if I understand you correctly, and that's a very thought-provoking idea, one of the revolutions that we need to do is through the kind of, the disappearance of middlemen or intermediaries. And that's one way in which we can maybe change the world, change the system.
Yeah.
If we think about the COVID crisis and trends that were there already, actually, before the COVID crisis, a number of countries, differently in different countries, but definitely there, may have been reinforced in the sense that the COVID crisis is localizing us much more. It's relocalizing us.
Yes, yes.
It's definitely forcing us to rethink the way in which we get food, the way in which we connect to each other, the way in which we do things, etc., etc. And so, if I want to be a bit positive, which I'm not always, they haven't heard me so positive in the last few days, but if I want to be a bit positive, maybe the COVID crisis is one important mechanism through which we can do that. We can actually consciously move towards ways of living, of consuming, of behaving that cut as much as possible intermediaries and middlemen. What do you think about this?
Oh yes, this is brilliant. In fact, COVID has contributed in a whole variety of ways to helping us understand how important the neighborhood is, where we live, who surrounds us, and you see a lot of very, very nice modes in which COVID actually is not simply a negative, but imposes on us, modes that are not all bad. I mean, there is clearly, we cannot say, oh, it's great to have COVID, right? Because too many people have died. But the irony is that something good has come out. And of course, I think I have heard people who are very deeply religious say that COVID is actually sent by the gods. They mostly say the God. I like to say the gods. And that we should sort of, respect it. I mean, I find that a bit too much. But it is interesting to see how it has generated a whole set of discussions among people that they never had before. It is sort of, it's quite amazing. So that is an interesting point. I also think at the same time that it depends how your housing situation is. Because if your housing situation is, you have a very tiny little place and you have 3 children, the positives of the virus disappear very quickly. But I do find it interesting whenever we have had a major crisis. I'm just thinking of the West now. I'm not thinking of the whole world, but I'm sure that this holds for many places in the world. Whenever we have had a major crisis that affects a very large segment of the people's, of the population of a country or of a city, something happens. It is like we respond, we wake up a bit, and we have innovations. People, and you have seen this in the last 2 years in Europe. It's sort of inventing little modes, constructing certain things, certain options within a building, a big building for people, etc., etc. So there is something like that. Now, there is also, a more analytic and abstract way of dealing with what is happening. And there we enter a different zone. And I alluded a bit to some of the stuff, because you have at one extreme tragedy. And we humans, we like a good film that has a tragedy, that has a good tragedy. But we are not really, I think, inclined to want too much tragedy in our lives. It's a burden, even if in retrospect we think of it as a positive very often. And so I have been surprised. Now I'm talking about New York and London. I have been surprised at how many people did not suffer too much, actually, because of being, forced to stay in their homes, with often small homes and children, etc. And I think that is an indication of the strength, that people can have that they didn't know they had. That, wow, the person who was always complaining about this and that and the this suddenly turns out to have survived a kind of incarceration. And to have and to show her strength. I found that very interesting. But, basically, I think what we have is a situation where this virus is not going away, and there will be other viruses. We know that, and the way I read it, which may be right or wrong, is that we have destroyed so much of the surface of our planet that we have induced some of this appearance of more and more viruses. For the longest time, they were just doing their thing. They were alone. And now we have robbed them from their places. Now, it must also be said that they say that this main virus that we have had, though it has come in many different versions, is actually a new virus. So that changes the situation a bit. But there are many viruses that are also hitting us. There are old viruses. They used to just be quiet because they had a bit of land. We'd have taken it away from them. And they start complaining, which one can understand.
Thank you very much. Are there questions in the room? We'll start here. Just when the microphone will come here. Thank you.
My question is more a theoretical one. I want to ask you if, in your opinion, there could be such a thing as the ethical intermediary. That is, does the figure of the intermediary, especially in today's increasingly complex society, always come paired with this extractive approach you talked to us about? Is there a way to actually turn intermediaries away or even against, possibly, this extractive approach they always come associated with?
Yeah. Yes, no, that's a very good point, and I thank you for it, because I did only really talk mostly when it came to the intermediary about the negatives of it, because they are the dominant ones, and they exist in so many different economic sectors that I think that it's very important for people to understand that this is a mode that we, the general public, we keep losing a bit. That I don't like that. But you're absolutely right. There are intermediaries that fulfill extremely important functions. And you see this not just in economic functions, but with healthcare issues, with housing questions, So intermediaries are not necessarily all negative. I'm sorry if I suggested that, because that was not my intention. But what I did say is that many strong economic sectors use intermediation as a way of extracting yet another bit of their advantage for them. And that has raised the prices of food, and that has done a whole part of things that are part of the daily life of many people. Now, I think in your country, you probably have more the farmer who produces and then brings it to the shop where you buy it, rather than running through an intermediary. But in many countries, instead of that direct link, it goes through an intermediary. Partly because in a big country, it's maybe the only way. But the result is really an extractive mode. And the question that I have is, could we have designed a better way of doing it? A bit more social justice. I mean, social justice is really suffering. Social justice is not doing very well in our current world. It really is remarkable. Social justice was never perfect. It was never everywhere. But it was a significant condition. Today, you don't even use the term very much. You don't hear it. And that, to me, is a little bit of a signal of a little death of certain conditions that we're beginning to take for granted, which in the past would have provoked us in anger. We would have said, this is not fair. How often do you hear today people say, this is not fair, when it deals to business factors? It's just language that you don't hear even. So that, that tells you something. I mean, on a general level, on a bigger level, one way of thinking about this all is that we have entered a new epoch. And in complex systems, it's not as visible as it may have been 100 years ago or 200 years ago, when you knew, oh my God, they destroyed, that royal house, and now we have a different. Today, no. Today, it's much more difficult to understand when something has foundationally changed of these complex systems that I'm talking about. So that is also part of the story here. I don't know if you understand what I'm talking about.
We do completely. Is there? Yes, Jacques. There's another question here.
Well, thank you very much. We do understand very, very well what you have been sharing with us. And thank you so much for sharing your present concern, your inquietude, what you are studying at the present time, and congratulations for your prize. I mean, the question I have has to do is how to deal with this paradox where more we know, more we become conscious of how much we don't know. And
That's
how
right.
we prepare ourselves for this exponential expansion of knowledge.
Yeah.
I wonder if your question couldn't be also how complexity become the seed of fundamentalism and populism. Because the impression we have is that the simplification of this complexity through one book, one enemy, one belief, or populism creating false expectation to the population, saying that everything is easy to solve. How to avoid complexity as a seed of violence through fundamentalism or through populism. And I wonder if this is something that you can help us how to prepare the new generation, how we prepare ourselves for this increasing complexity. Regarding supply chain, I would join my colleague that made the second question. And I think that she's right. More and more NGOs are screening the intermediaries. We can see this in the Amazon region. I mean, those business people that are there planting soya and meat is not anymore only there. The whole supply chain, including the banks, are being pressured by NGOs, saying, well, this has to stop.
Yeah.
And the impression we have is that it's obviously a move, but you are right in saying there is a secret world that we don't know about. And there is a rhetoric, and then there is the reality that you could hear on secret tapes, but obviously nobody else has access to the meetings and to the intimate discussions in the financial system. But thank you so much for your thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, that were several very interesting points that you have mentioned, and I sort of agree with the way you were presenting them. Huh? I guess what I would emphasize in a way that, as far as I can tell, most of my colleagues, for instance, would not. They just don't see it. They just don't see it. What I see is a new mode of economic and inevitably also social, hence, ways of doing stuff, executing projects, designing projects. I don't mean just projects, I mean how we live, really, how we survive, I tend to think that, as I said, that we have entered a new period, and it's not a great one. There are a lot of the really positive element are the young people who don't want cars, they care about the environment. And with those modalities, sooner or later, they will get into these more complex situations and also understand when a big, famous, highly respected firm is actually abusing its own power. Because that's part of what I was getting at, right? That firms that we have long respected and that we knew that they're clean, etc., the extent to which there is an extractive mode in play, that you grab a bit from everything. This is truly a problematic situation that we have. And that is something that we need to pay attention to. And as I mentioned, we have some, like these Dutch people who uncovered these financial firms taking about just a little from every single retired worker's wages. That kind of stuff you say, and that doesn't fall from the sky. They have to make it. So one way of responding to your comment is that there is a lot of making that is happening that is invisible to us. We don't know it exists, but that is playing a very important role in unsettling what we have inherited as the typical, liberal society economies. We really, and I repeat, we really have entered a new epoch, but in complex systems, we have a very difficult time understanding that a major transformation has happened, because these systems have so many different elements, and it might just be one or two major dynamics in these systems that is producing that change. And that change consists, and I have now been looking at this for 30 years, it involves extracting and concentrating the positives, whether that is money, power, access, whatever it is. This is not a good period. The hope lies with the young generations who are starting that they don't want cars, they just want bikes or whatever. That's already a very good sign. And there are many other good signs in these new generations. But again, in complex systems, change, whether positive or negative, can be very difficult to detect. And we're in that now. We are in that sort of period. We're in that phase. I think we in the West. China is again different. I do a lot of work also in China. So,
another question?
Thank you very much, Professor Sassen. I have two questions or two comments. I want your feedback about the morality of extraction when knowledge is not there. There's a price for everything. So does extraction, is it morally justified when the parties do not have the knowledge?
That's a very easy, oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. The second point is that the societies are evolving. And when do we say this is the reality of things and we have to accept it? And I'm just thinking now of the privacy, our privacy with the internet, with evolution. When do we have to say this is how things evolved and they're going to stay this way? And then when do we have to say we have to interfere and say this is wrong?
Yeah, excellent.
Thank you very much.
These are excellent comments. You can hear me, yeah?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. And let me just start with the last one. This is one of the key elements that I was trying to develop in this talk, and that is, how do we know when to intervene? What's the point of entry? Do we have access? I don't mean access to money. I mean access to a situation where something can be made. You know, a decision to criticize or to try to eliminate, you know, a bad landlord, whatever it might be. You know, I mean in positives here. And I mean, one way of putting it is that number one, complex systems are not easy to understand in terms of their changes. We tend to hang on to the older explanation, you know, far too long, if you want. I don't know if that was a clear sentence, but we move slowly. Very often we move slowly when it is not about our own lives, you know, when it is some complex systematicity that is there creating changes, that we notice the changes. So number two, I think that a lot of people who in the past would have been very active activists with a will to, you know, intervene and to criticize, today being that way can be more difficult because we are dealing with very complex systems with many intermediations. So, you know, 50 years ago, a building was a building. Well, today, a building is of a complexity, you know, some of the new buildings with forms of knowledge embedded in how it was built that most of us citizens don't notice that, we don't see that. So we already there are on a weak standing because we don't understand the process. We just see the outcome. It's a building. But a lot of the story lies in the process. And the process is something that we don't understand. Let me give an example here just to help, because I realize this is not necessarily so easy to understand. We now have a situation where in some cities, London, New York, I'm sure not in your city, it's more profitable for an enterprise to have a grand building that is empty than one that is occupied. Guess why? Why? Because the way they're making their money is by reducing what we see as a building, a beautiful building. It actually becomes, via algorithmic math, it becomes a set of assets that you can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell. If you have a great empty building, really a nice, well done empty building, you can actually today in certain markets, because it takes algorithmic math, means that you have to have a whole bunch of physicists working for Goldman Sachs to do this. But that building, you know, empty, hey, it could be better than an occupied building. Because what you're doing is the building is no longer a building. The building is like a field of assets that you can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell. Now, I know that this is abstract, but I'm sure that some of you understand what I'm saying. So now that's the extreme case what I gave you. And you see it in London, you see it in New York, you see it a bit in Paris, but you don't see it in a lot of countries. And I don't know about Switzerland. I don't want to commit to a yes or no, but we will leave that aside. So that is one kind of issue. Now, you also, I think, was it you that asked about cities evolving and how do we know? Because I didn't quite address that fully. And then there is this whole question of the morality of extraction. When is it acceptable and needed and can be a positive, and when is it a negative? These are all clearly complex conditions, and the way I'm talking about them is a bit abstract because I'm not talking about a specific building, because it's also tricky to talk about some of these buildings because there are major firms that own, don't want to get into too much trouble, et cetera, et cetera. But there is, we really are, I mean, the simplest way to put it, which is also an invitation to go check it out, is that we have entered a new epoch that is marked by a set of novel complexities that are not all self-evident, that most of us do not necessarily fully understand or even see. That means, for instance, that what we think is a building is a building is a building. Actually, the reason the building exists is that it is a field of assets. We don't see that. We just see the building. But the people who are doing the financiers, for them it's not a building. It's a field of assets that you can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell many times in one day. And concentrate money. Finance didn't become as rich as it is. High finance is one of the richest sectors in the whole world. In all the, like in New York and in London, in the major firms. They have brilliant mechanisms through which they execute projects that have little to do with what we understood is I build a house, or a house is a house or a building is a building. No, some of these, yeah, it is a building. But as I said, an empty building is even better than, I'm talking big towers, is even better than a full building, because an empty building, you can buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, buy, sell, the door, the toilet, the whole room, the whole whatever, many, many times, because it's invisible. It is no longer building. It functions as an asset, a materiality. It could be the toilet. It could be the living room, so to speak, that part of the. So that brings us, these are the extreme conditions. That brings us to a point where we need to find new languages and new ways of capturing these transformations. Now, I'm sorry, I think I didn't quite answer your question, or one of the questions. So one question here that I had was that how systems evolve, how do we know when they are evolving? That's a very important point, because a lot of what I'm describing to you, if you're simply walking on the street along these buildings that I'm describing, you wouldn't know all the stuff that I mentioned about those buildings and how they are bringing in a lot of wealth. Because it's not by renting them out. Renting out, no, that's for the little guys, so to speak. So now these, again, I want to repeat, what I'm describing to you are the most extreme cases, but they're happening in many, 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 certainly in the highly developed world. This is a new modality, and it is very problematic. It is problematic to cities, because cities don't thrive with that. Okay, I'm talking too much, yes.
Yeah, we have two more questions.
Okay.
So
Yes.
we have one more in the room, and then we'll have at least one from the online people.
Yeah.
Hello. I wanted to take a more concrete example of disintermediation, since you mentioned it. And I was thinking in terms of cryptocurrencies or centrally banked digital currencies, which in fact sort of knocks out the banks. But in a way, they still take a small amount, a fee. And so my question would be, do you really believe that technology can help with disintermediation, or is it the same thing at just a lower, perhaps more acceptable level?
Okay.
Saskia, do you want us to take the second question? So we do them together. Yeah, Dan, please.
So yeah, hi. I've been monitoring the online questions. We've had over 64 people watching us online, and one question came in about the example you gave of financial firms, these big financial firms taking small amounts from millions of people's pensions funds. You mentioned that the average individual doesn't fight this given the amounts are small, and that they wouldn't know where to start.
Yeah.
And
yes.
so the question is, can the model that you mentioned very quickly that is being adapted in the Netherlands, can that model be adapted in other countries or markets?
Well, can I answer?
Yes, please.
Sure.
Let me start by answering this very concrete question, because what the Dutch have done, it took them 2 years, and they actually established with enormous clarity the extent to which these funds, these are support funds, for workers, right? How they had been invaded, if you want, by financial firms who just took this little, as I said, right? Now, to make the actual discovery that this was happening when the amount was so little that they took out of every account, of these retired people, that took a lot of time, a lot of effort. And when they started, they did not necessarily know where they would wind up, right? That whether this was even worth it. Maybe this was just something that was happening on a very, very small scale. We have always had little crooks on small scales, right? And so the question then was that just the old way? You just grab a lid, you cheat a bit, etc. You are in charge of the fund and you take a bit. Or whether this was another modality. Well, they established it was another modality, and it was one that grabbed from the whole full chain, not just a little here, when the boss wasn't looking, so to speak. So now, this is absolutely a negative. This is unforgivable. This is breaking the law, etc. Whether it was big or small, they were just simply breaking the law. So that is one element. Second element, I want to give you an illustration of something that is very visible and yet is breaking the law knowingly. And this is a very simple example I'm going to give you. And it will answer only a little bit of what you were asking. It's another version of it. So we're in the field, somewhere in the United States, and there are these big, huge trucks moving huge sheets of wood around. And so we begin talking, at some stop or another, and say, well, I said, so what are you doing with all of these huge? He said, we don't know. All we know, I'm making it very short, all we know is that we have to move these things around all the time from one big field to another big field. These are sort of huge elements of wood and metals, that kind of stuff. Well, this was uncovered, not by us, by the way, but the law caught on. And they all went to trial, etc. Guess what it was? This was Goldman Sachs. And the record is there. Goldman Sachs had hired these truckers to move these huge but very valuable bits of metal and wood that are used in construction, that are used to build ships, that are used, in all kinds of things. So Goldman Sachs buys all of this, sets up the truckers to move it around, and guess what? Has the thing on the market, the financial market, by having the truckers move it around, what happened? They delayed, God, hang on, I'm really sorry. They delayed delivery. Delayed delivery translates in the world of finance as, oopsie, there is a shortage, there is a problem here, we can raise the prices. So all Goldman Sachs, a financial firm, did was have these truckers move it around, big fields, in the Midwest there from the United States, in order to create a crisis on the markets, the financial market, saying, oh my God, we're running out of metal sheets and wood. Now, that is a very visible element, and it went to court, and they were fined $3 billion, which is nothing for them really, et cetera, right? But do you understand what we're talking about? They're willing to set up Goldman Sachs, one of the most distinguished financial firms. They're willing to set up a whole operation that is an imaginary operation in order to create a crisis on the markets. We're running out of metal and wood for construction, that then would raise the prices, and they trot in then the goods that they have and charge a much higher price. Now, this is a high-level financial firm doing all this stuff. Once you hear these stories, you can begin to understand, wow, the mafia was kindergarten, the way they handle their power. This stuff, I mean, it's just extraordinary. And so they create this crisis on the financial markets that lasts 2 days, a month. It just varies, depends on the product, but often it's like 2 or 3 days. And they raise the money, and then they sell. And they make just much more money than they planned for. I invite you, what you raised, it's yet another kind of issue a bit, but I invite you to just listen to this, because this is a very sort of basic material operation that we can all understand as a way of seeing how these high-level financial firms and these, these brilliant, they're brilliant workers who they just love the work, but they have nothing to do with it, really, how they're operating. This is new stuff. This didn't used to be done this way. And so that is just one of the stories. I'm talking too much. Why don't you stop me?
Thank you, Saskia. Yes, I guess I have to stop you because we've reached the end of the session. So let me again thank you so very much and congratulate you on the prize. Thank you very much for sharing those thoughts with us. Thank you to all of you and for your really smart and bright questions. And stay safe. Are you in London?
Thank you very much. Thank you. It has been an honor, really.
Thank you very much.
Yes.
Bye. Are you in London or in the US? Yeah.
I'm now in London, actually.
Okay. So stay safe.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you.
Nice to see
Bye.
you. Bye.
So I just close up, right?
Yes, that's great. Thank
Close
you.
me up.